All right, so you're in for it now. Welcome to lecture one in this series of lectures related to American government. Thought I would take it easy on you. We'll start with something light, like early theoretical foundations of U.S. government here. Look, that's a very complicated, not so complicated way of saying we want to understand kind of what were the initial thoughts and ideas that sort of led to the current system of government we have. So there's a natural flow to this class, and by the end of the class, it'll kind of all make sense here. But what we're starting out with right now is, what were the principal sort of ideas that the founding fathers and the drafters of the Constitution were pulling from? And it turns out to understand that you actually have to go pretty far back here. So let's go ahead and jump into this. So look, this idea of U.S. government, despite what some people might think, was not sort of divinely given to the founders in the clutches of a bald eagle that sort of came down from a mountain or something, mythical like that. It was actually a reflective of an evolution of really centuries of thought into political ideas and what it is to run a government, and what are the responsibilities of a government to its citizens and to between the citizens and their government here. So here's the cool thing. I very much doubt that anybody else teaching Intro to American Government at Wake Tech or most places for that matter is going to go back and talk to you about, the early Greeks and some of the, very origins of Greek political philosophy and how it directly sort of interacts with American government. But fortunately for you, your professor is a bit of a Greek philosophy nerd, like many people are. And so this was actually my minor in graduate school was actually early political philosophy. And so because of that, you get to learn it as well. So we're going to go back, but we're going to really sort of go way back. Fun fact here, the piece of art on the right is from a depiction of Plato's Apology. It's where Socrates is essentially committing court-ordered suicide, and his friends are trying to convince him not to, and he makes this very poignant argument in this section to say, hey, who am I as a citizen if I don't abide by my government's regulations? I can't just do what my government wants me to do when it's convenient for me. So he drinks the hemlock and he ends up dying, according to the story there. It's actually pretty important in sort of political philosophy. So, let's look at our U.S. government and sort of what are the kind of principal values when the founders of the U.S. Constitution and sort of those individuals whose ideas were sort of most important in the founding of our government, when they were looking to create a government after we had, separated or with the idea of separating from Great Britain, what were the things that they were looking to accomplish? Well, much like a company, if you want to understand, sort of what's most important to a company, I laugh because half the time this isn't true, you would go to their mission statement, right? Well, the United States' mission statement is essentially kind of the preamble to the Constitution here, right? So I'm not going to read the whole thing to you here, and perhaps you've gotten in high school government and stuff. A lot of people have the the first words that "we the people" tattooed maybe on their forearm or something when they're carrying a loaded weapon around. But this is the preamble here. If you pull out sort of what are kind of the core ideas here, like we want to form this government, what's most important to us here? 5 things really pop out. Justice, so making sure that people are treated fairly. Civility, so let's all get along. Protection, so the government should provide protection to its citizens. Welfare, so not only should we protect the lives of our citizens, but we should look out for their general welfare and being. And then this concept of liberty or freedom. So let's just give you a kind of high-level overview of kind of the philosophical timeline and sort of how it contributed to the formation of the United States and how philosophical thought really sort of drives a lot of the conversations even today here. So we're going to talk a little bit about some of the ancient philosophies today, particularly during the Greek time period. So I'm oversimplifying this a little bit here, but the early Greeks really inspired the Romans, and then you get into the medieval and Renaissance philosophers there, which is a really cool period. And then you get, they largely inspired what we consider classic and modern philosophy. So this is, you're talking 16th, 17th century, and these are the sort of ideas that probably are most salient to the foundation of the U.S. government. So we'll talk about that today. We'll talk about social contract theory. Then you have the constitutional framers who take all these ideas and sort of package it into a constitution. We form a government, but really, if you think about it today, political philosophy still goes on in a lot of contexts. It's not just the guy serving you coffee at Starbucks who has 3 philosophy degrees. It's actually, you can see in other ways, shapes, and forms, just in, the major political thought leaders of the last 2 centuries. We can think of, for instance, on the far left there, you got Karl Marx, who a lot of people on this side of the world don't particularly care for, but he was actually an economist / sociologist, but very much a political philosopher, right? On the flip side, somebody who, they would not necessarily agree on anything. Ayn Rand, we'll talk about her to some extent, author of The Fountainhead. But even look in the modern context, and I don't watch cable news, and I don't know who the current talking heads are. But when I put these slides together, I had Rachel Maddow and Sean Hannity. Again, we wouldn't, maybe not consider these people philosophical thinkers, but they're putting out ideas about our political institutions, right? And they're shaping perspectives and thus shaping our government. So it's an evolution, and we should probably include it in this discussion. So I'd like to introduce you to Skeptical Duck. So one of the struggles I have teaching online is I want the back and forth, right? I want students to be able to be critical of some of the things that we're talking about here, or some of the things that I sort of posit to you here, but that's not really possible in this context. So a couple years ago, I created this figure, Skeptical Duck, and the creation story is actually really simple. I type Skeptical Duck into Google, and this is what it came up with, and I was like, that's the perfect image here. So he's going to pop up. He or she, haven't really associated gender to the duck, is going to pop up at various points this semester during lectures to sort of provide kind of a critical perspective. And a lot of times he's actually mean about it because he's a product of my own creation there. And I guess, I don't know, that's a subject for therapy or something, but he's a little bit hard on me sometimes. So welcome, Skeptical Duck. So he says here, wait a minute. Sure seems like our government has an old dead white guy problem. Didn't other cultures contribute political thoughts and ideas? The duck is correct here. So one of the challenges in really sort of the study of Western political thought is that so much of that thought came from old dead white males, and that's not to say that there wasn't a lot of great philosophy and ideas coming out of other parts of the world, particularly if you look at a lot of the Asian philosophies that come out of the various dynasties, even well before kind of the Greek period, to the extent that we have historical sort of awareness of it, and other Middle Eastern philosophies and that sort of thing. The challenge in what you have to understand here is that we're looking at sort of a causal linkage here to, ultimately we want to get to who were the founders thinking about when they were drafting our Constitution and creating our system of government. And unfortunately, who they were learning about in school was a lot of old dead white guys. And so that's why their influence is so heavy. But the duck is correct here. We do unfortunately shortchange a lot of the ideas that come from other cultures, just because they're not as directly relevant to the creation of our own government. Now, they obviously become more relevant in more contemporary times as we get more exposure to them. So let's start out with, sort of the Bible of early political thought, which is Plato's Republic. So who was Plato? Founder of the Academy. Student of Socrates here. The Academy was actually the foundation for every higher educational institution that's ever existed. In fact, the term academia actually originates from Plato's Academy, which was sort of the first recognized school of philosophy. But he was a student of a guy named Socrates. He's obviously considered a very pivotal figure in Western philosophy. He was born about 428 BC here. So it's interesting, even though he was born, 400 and something years or 400 years or so before Christ, he's actually heavily influential in early Christian philosophy, particularly in the medieval era there. So he wrote a work called The Republic, which is really sort of a collection of works that were sort of packaged together. And in it, he's going to detail a lot of core concepts around justice as it relates to the relationship between people and their governments. One of the cool things that drove me towards an interest in political philosophy philosophy, particularly during this time period, is that they're talking about a lot of the same stuff that we still deal with today. So we'll cover a little bit of that here, but this is Plato. So Plato, as I mentioned, was a student of Socrates, and this is historically an interesting relationship here because Plato writes a lot about Socrates principally because Socrates never wrote anything. So we don't know the extent to which Plato's depictions of Socrates and his ideas are accurate, of whether he was sort of creating this character around Socrates. We do know he was a real person. Socrates is interesting. So he kind of lived this street life. He kind of walked around and taught people, and they would essentially give him money for it, or he would tutor the young men of Athens here. And he was sort of unique and distinguished because Socrates was very opposed in his philosophy and his way of being to what were known as the sophists. And again, when I talk about how much things don't change, you could think of sophists as kind of the early ancestors of the social media influencer, right? So Socrates' criticism of the sophists were that they didn't really have any knowledge about much of anything, but they spoke as if they did. They would use a lot of, dramatic speech and euphemisms. They were essentially the kind of self-help gurus of early Greece. And for Socrates and some of the traditional philosophers, they saw this as sort of a weak intellectual effort that was just emotionally moving people, whereas Socrates was more focused on sort of reason, kind of in logic. So use your favorite example of a TikTok star or YouTube star that's hawking something without any real sort of knowledge of kind of how it works. Plato's writings, as I mentioned, often invoke Socrates as a character here. I may sometimes in exam questions I'll ask, which of these did Socrates write? And it's actually a little bit of a trick question because Socrates didn't publish anything. So just remember that. But two of the principal concepts that he's most concerned with here: justice and the ideal state. And so that is a theme that's going to continue thereon in subsequent waves of political philosophy for many centuries to come. What we need to pull from Socrates here, or Plato, if you will, is the five regimes, because what we see here is the establishment of a ranking order that Socrates identifies. So you remember at the time, Athens was a democracy per se. I'm blurry, so you can't really see my air quotes. But Athens was technically a democracy, although we know that was limited, right? Because voting and participation in the Senate was open to all citizens, but to be a citizen meant you had to be male and not a slave, which was actually a minority of the population of Athens at the time. So Socrates identifies five forms of government, and he's going to list them in ranking of preference here. And the best system of government, according to Socrates, is not democracy, it's aristocracy, which is a form of government that places power in the hands of a small, privileged ruling class. And Socrates' big thing and his big push was this idea of a philosopher king. And that's, again, getting back to the origins of the academy, the idea here that Plato built upon was that if we create this educational system, we can bring students up through it. And then in the end, we have these super educated beings who will just make reasoned and just decisions here. If you think about it, what's the terminal degree in higher ed? It's a PhD, right? What does PhD stand for? It's Doctorate of Philosophy. So no matter what it's in, if you get a PhD in mathematics, you have a Doctorate of Philosophy in mathematics. Of course, if you get a PhD in philosophy, you have Doctorate of Philosophy in philosophy. But this is where it all sort of started here. So Socrates believed that we would have this educational system. It would produce these very well-reasoned men, unfortunately, and we could pick from the best of them, and those would be our leaders, and they would just make good and just decisions, and we would just rely upon those decisions moving forward. The next system of government that he mentions here is Timocracy. So he argues that, and there's an evolution to this. So he says, you've got this aristocracy, it's chugging along. He said the natural devolution here is that aristocracy will become a Timocracy. And this is when essentially people of an inferior nature are sort of able to kind of get through the system, and we mistakenly identify them as philosopher kings. The definition here at Timocracy is government ruled by those inclining rather to the more high-spirited and simple-minded type who are better suited for war. This was an incredible insult here. He's saying, very happy idiots are who runs the government during this situation. And, no disrespect here to Tim Tebow, but the very best way I can get you to memorize this is if I use him as an example. If you remember, Tim Tebow, very high-spirited. I won't say anything about his intelligence because I really don't know, but hopefully it helps you remind you of Timocracy here. So this was not ideal, but Socrates was actually okay with it because he said, the thing about under a Timocracy is that you have rulers that aren't particularly smart, but they're good people, right? They're still trying to do the right thing, and so they may not have the mental capabilities to make all the right decisions, but their heart's in the right place, essentially. The duck's back here. Hey, Tebow's a good guy. Despite your feelings about University of Florida, you can't question his grit or character. Yes, Tim Tebow is unequivocally a good guy. Again, he's out of the public sphere a little bit. Maybe I need to update these slides. Something with somebody different here. Again, I'm only using him because it makes it easy to remember. I would use Urban Meyer if I was gonna, come up with a better example. Okay, so Timocracy eventually devolves, and it devolves into what's known as oligarchy. So Socrates believed that the oligarchy would emerge when the good intentions of rulers lost out to financial greed. And so basically here, the Timocratic leader discovers that they can use their place in government leadership to make themselves financially wealthy here. That creates the oligarchy, was a system of government where power rests with a small group of influential individuals who are really just concerned with protecting their own interests and power. He saw this as invariably sort of separating kind of the rich from the poor, right? And so from the perspective of Socrates, he said this is where you'll start to see the large chasm grow between sort of the haves and have-nots here. You would have some observers of the current of our current political system, in fact, most of U.S. history, that would argue that it in very many ways represents an oligarchy, not just the U.S. but a lot of sort of Western democracies. And it's debatable the extent to which it does or does not, but it's an argument that's out there. Code word, just so I don't forget, because usually I'm going to forget until the very end to give you there, but I'll give it to you here. Since I'm thinking of the Monopoly man, we'll make the code word Monopoly. You can provide that, and heed my advice there. If you've got young kids, it's the absolute worst. Every time my kids pull out Monopoly, I'm like, why? Never ends well. It always ends with a table getting flipped over and pieces everywhere. Use Monopoly as your code word for your attendance this week. Then we get to democracy. So what's worse than oligarchy, according to Socrates, is democracy here. So he believed that the poorer classes would eventually, seek out greater freedom. They would start to realize that the oligarchs are sort of, squandering everything for themselves. They would push for greater freedom, and that would lead to democracy, which is a system of government where the people have the authority to deliberate and decide on legislation here. So interestingly enough, again, and Socrates wouldn't be popular for this today, but he sees freedom as slavery, essentially, in democracy. Believed that the democratic man would become a slave to unnecessary desires, namely money. So given the ability to govern themselves, Socrates says everybody will just look out for their own interests, and they'll essentially be a slave to stuff and the accumulation of wealth and stuff. Take a moment and pause if this is, if you can think of some contemporary examples, particularly having just come out of Christmas and having bought my kids a lot of stuff, it really sort of resonates with me here. And so finally, the only regime that Socrates sees as being worse than democracy is tyranny. So this excessive longing for freedom, Socrates argues, would give way to tyranny, where really nobody is in power. And eventually, what he says is that you have this power vacuum that emerges because everybody's just trying to get what they want out of the political system, and this advantageous tyrant will emerge, and they'll rule as kind of an absolute ruler, unrestrained by the law, and really their only focus is on their own unjust desires. So it's no longer I want to accumulate wealth; it's I want to hurt and harm, and I want people to love me, and that's sort of the role of the tyrant. With maybe fans of the Harry Potter movies will appreciate my choice here as an example. I didn't want to offend anybody by throwing up any given politician. Socrates saw tyranny as existing one space above complete lawlessness, and the furthest system from, again, that aristocracy, which he saw as the most honorable sort of governing system because it pursued honor and justice. And now you've ended up with a system that just pursues somebody's kind of fickle desires here. And if you think about historical tyrannies, I mean, we'll use Saddam Hussein in Iraq, right? It's arguable that you could argue that regime really just sort of existed, for the pleasure of Saddam Hussein and his family, given some of the excesses and other things and atrocities that were committed under his power. So let's go back to Plato's criticism of democracy here, because it's very important. Because look, at this point, particularly if you're young, up to this point in your education, your education on democracy it's great. You should love it. It's very important in a higher education class like this, where we're being critical, to understand that there are legitimate criticisms of democracy that we don't have to agree or disagree with. We just have to consider here, right? So Plato's criticism, or Socrates, depending on who it came from, it really sort of actually factors into the founding fathers' own concerns. And when we sort of explore the Federalist Papers and the development of U.S. federalism, this will really sort of come out. The most notable was Socrates didn't feel that voters were essentially smart enough to make decisions for themselves. He said it's not suitable for the masses. It's not a random intuition. It requires adequate training and skill, according to Plato. So if you think about it, there's in a representative democracy, depending on where you live, there's a lot of different issues where in a direct democracy system, which we'll talk about, you may, like if you live in California, you may be voting on a lot of citizen initiatives where there's a complicated policy matter that you as citizens have to vote on. Other issues are settled through representative democracy, right? So I elect somebody to the North Carolina State House, so they can make decisions on my behalf, so I don't have to consider all this. But Plato's argument here, he actually uses the metaphor here of a ship captain, and he said, you've got to cross a really rocky part of the Aegean Sea. Who are you going to get to do it? The average citizen, Joe Schmo, who maybe has a bass boat, has never really, sailed a large ocean vessel, or do you want the seasoned captain who's been doing it for decades and has a lot of experience? And he treats voting much the same way there, right? So everybody shouldn't be able to vote. It should really only be the people who've demonstrated a capability to consider the topics with reason and justness in mind. So that's kind of the big takeaway. Again, I always feel bad because I'm taking, that was essentially 4 graduate courses for me, and I just summarized it in 6 slides. But I wanted to focus mostly on what's most relevant to the foundation of U.S. government, because that's what this class is about here. We're skipping over a lot of the medieval and Renaissance area philosophers. So during the medieval period, it's really all about God. And when I talked about how a lot of these early Christian scholars, Thomas Aquinas, for instance, City of God is actually a really awesome piece of philosophy. It's not going to be super easy to read, but it's one of those things. If you want a piece of philosophical literature to keep on you to make yourself look more interesting, mine is actually Seneca. I have the book actually here in my bag, but that would be a good one to use there. When you get to the Renaissance period, again, it's reflected in art and culture and writings. The focus more becomes on the individual for the first time. So what is the self, and what is the relationship of the self to others and to governments and that sort of thing? We're going to skip all that. We're going to go over to social contract theory here, which is 1600, 1700 AD sort of ish. So, whereas the Renaissance theorists focused on humanism, specifically the relationship of kind of the self to the self and self-actualization and all these fun things here, modern political, modern political theory here shifts again to explore the relationship between more so the self and the state, so the government. What are the responsibilities of one to the other here? And what we get out of this is what's known as social contract theory. So it's this body of philosophy that's concerned with the relationship between the person and the government they agree to be subject to here. So the idea is if I'm born in the United States, if I decide to continue living here, it's because I've agreed to a contract with the government that says that I will give up certain freedoms in exchange for the government's protection of my safety and interest and other things like that. Most social contract theories start with an exploration of this hypothetical scenario of the behaviors and intentions of man in this, what we refer to as state of nature. So state of nature is a system where there is no government, there's no, you're not going to be penalized for doing anything. You can steal and murder and do whatever you want, and nobody's there to punish you other than, somebody who's bigger and stronger than you can kill you faster, or that sort of thing. State of nature differs from anarchy. Anarchy is a system where you had a government and then it went away. State of nature is there's never been a government. And we're going to use that as a model here to sort of understand the nature of man. And when I say man, obviously I'm talking about men, women, those are binary, everybody. So let's go through some of these. We'll start with Thomas Hobbes, who wrote the Leviathan. So if you're studying this time period, there's a few philosophical pieces that are particularly critical. This is one of them. Hobbes was an English philosopher. He wrote on the social contract theory. Think of Hobbes as glass half empty, right? He argues that the true state of man is selfishness, a desire for survival, and thus the state of nature. If we had the situation without any government, basically it's solitary, poor, brutish, nasty, and short. So everybody would be killing everybody else to get their, carrots or lettuce or whatever you're growing or picking and that sort of thing. Nobody would get along with anybody else because there would be no reason to, right? Your only goal is to survive and eat and thrive and reproduce and that sort of thing. As such, I would say Hobbes, is much like a cat. Although, to be fair, I am a cat person here, so I do love cats. And so again, in some ways, I kind of appreciate this about their personality here. Hobbes was actually inspired by Machiavelli, who argued, the Italian writer, that government should be all powerful and ruthless in its governing, in order to protect its citizens. If you've taken my international relations class, or will take it in the future, this becomes relevant in sort of the discussion of realism versus the other forms of liberalism and other forms of international relations are. Another visit from the Ducks. There's actually a lot in this first one here. So he says, so Hobbes and a bunch of other advocates of brutal tyrannies were inspired by Niccolo Machiavelli, but weren't his writings supposed to be a joke? So this is one of the, big sort of nerd debates in medieval literature and philosophy here. So, and I think it's kind of the sick twist in political history. So, Machiavelli wrote The Prince, but he didn't really write The Prince. He wrote a bunch of different essays, and like all truly great philosophers and writers, he died poor and unappreciated for anything. And then his friends got together afterwards and said, we're going to put them all into a book. So a lot of people read this book and they took it very seriously. He said, a leader should do what's necessary, even if that includes killing other people or stealing and plundering from other governments to maintain power, because by maintaining power, that's how you keep your people safe here. The problem is, and again, this is a subject of debate, but I very much have a clear stance on this. What do you do on a Friday night? Do you go out with your friends, watch a football game, have a few drinks? Professor Strickland is reading deep philosophical theories and on Machiavelli and what he sort of meant. The argument here is that it was a joke. So he had this long-standing feud with the Medici family in Italy. The idea here is that he was writing this as satire to get back at them, but he wasn't around to explain it, because by the time his friends put it into a book, he was dead. And then you end up having this situation where all these horrible rulers end up taking his words very seriously. Joseph Stalin, for instance, who killed many millions of his own people, did so under sort of the premises established accomplished in the Prince, and he's just one of many. So it's really, actually, I mean, I joke about it, but it's really a sad and unfortunate tale of sort of great misunderstanding here. So that won't be on the exam, but it's just sort of an aside for anybody that's interested. So let me get to John Locke, and I would argue that no single person probably had more influence on the system of government that you and I currently live in today in the United States than John Locke. He was an English philosopher and physician. You can see he lived till about 1704, or actually to 1704. Hobbes would have been glass half full. So he saw man as intrinsically good. He said in the state of nature, look, all men are created equal and they have an intrinsic motivation to preserve civil engagement, right? It does me no good to be in this situation where I'm constantly fearful of all of my neighbors. It's better if we just enter into agreements, and that way, we all get along and we don't live in that constant state of fear like we were, animals or something. Locke saw the government's role as securing what he calls life, liberty, and the protection of property for its citizens. If that sounds familiar, because later on it becomes life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That's the actual origin of that phrase. He protested the monarchy, which was, challenging when you live in England. He argued that humans had an inalienable right to govern themselves rather than have laws and regulations sort of bestowed upon them by a monarch. And in that sense, John Locke is generally considered the father of liberalism. When I say liberalism, I'm not talking about, look, we all have that uncle in our family full of conspiracy theories and, probably hates the liberal ideology and progressive ideologies. We're not talking about that liberalism. We're talking about the liberalism, this very specific notion that, humans should be able to govern themselves. That is that definition of liberalism, not the, how we generally consider it sort of in the contemporary political context. And then finally, I just wanted to mention Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Swiss philosopher. He wrote The Social Contract, so he actually just titled his book that. Believed that governance is an innate right of the people and not monarchs, similar to Locke here, but that he believed that people are inherently good, but are essentially dependent upon societal structures to maintain equality. So people are good, but once you get them together, inequality will sort of exist because people still have a desire to accumulate more and sort of gather more. So if Hobbes is on one end here and Locke is on the other, Rousseau's kind of sort of in the middle. What's funny is my camera, for some reason, I have some issue where when I'm looking at it, I'm upside down. So it's hard for me to navigate my hands here. So he argued that the purpose of government is actually to create equality in law that protects the interests of those, with less power. So as you might imagine, that becomes heavily influential in our current system of government, where there is a focus on sort of justice for all and trying to preserve equality. He opposed representative democracy, so the system, like I mentioned, where we select representatives to vote for us. He favored instead direct democracy, where all matters are voted on all citizens by themselves, and you can imagine why that would be particularly complicated to do, particularly given the number of issues that a legislature votes on in a given year. So by way of summary here, I've given you Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau, varying viewpoints on the roles of individuals in government here. Find a way to remember that Hobbes thinks people are evil and that government needs to be oppressive to keep them in check, to keep those evil desires at bay. Locke, father of liberalism, said, nope, people are good. Government should sort of reflect that. And Rousseau said, people are mostly good, but left to their own will, they still need government to sort of keep things kind of in check here. These thoughts related to liberty, governing structures, and acceptable authority, again, become very salient to the founding fathers as they're drafting the Constitution. So the next lecture here, you're through your first one. Congratulations. The next one will cover federalism. So that's sort of the next evolution of where we sort of go at here. So this idea of how should we structure a government in the context of some of these thoughts that we've just talked about here. If you missed it earlier, the code word was monopoly. That's right. Provide that and you'll get attendance credit for this lecture here. Hopefully you enjoyed that and you've been inspired to explore Greek political philosophy. If you are, let me know. I'd be curious to see if that is anyone. But we'll see you next time. Thanks so much.